Right, hello Year 11. We're going to do the next part of our revision for the ethics part of the course. So we're going to do some mind mapping, or you can make some notes on your devices, or however you kind of want to do it. If you printed out the A3 document from last lesson, you will have a section on that mind map which you can use to help you, and it has some stimulus questions about the issues of life and death. I'm going to upload my camera quickly. There we are. So you can just see where we are. So we're going to do the ethics side of it. We're going to talk about life and death. So this is abortion. This is euthanasia. This is talking about the sort of moral questions around that, as well as the sanctity of life. And we're going to go through the quotations that you need for this as well. And so we're going to keep it quite simple and keep it quite sort of snappy. I'm going to try and keep this video to about sort of 20 minutes maximum, and then after this we'll go out into our normal lesson. We'll have a conversation, we'll break out into rooms and do some debating and so on. Okay, right, I'm going to minimise me and put the PowerPoint on, and then talk you through the key ideas. So put in the middle of your PowerPoint issues of life and death. So this is the module we did last year, at the beginning of year 10. Okay. Right, so the first topic that comes up in this section is about creation, about where the universe, where the world kind of came from. And so we've got the key ideas you need to know about. So we know that it's in the Bible, it tells us about the creation of the world. The idea of ex nihilo, creation out of nothing, and so God created the world out of nothing. And you have different interpretations of this. You have the literal and non-literal interpretations. Literal means it's word for word true. The world was created literally in 6 periods of 24 hours with 1 day of rest. A non-literal interpretation would mean that it's maybe a symbolic or poetic, and so that would allow room for a scientific explanation. And so it could be evolution, it could be Big Bang, there could be a more naturalistic way of explaining where the world kind of came from. A couple of quotes to support the ideas of kind of creation. The first one is from the Christian faith. Lord is God who created heaven and earth. So I'd write that down next to your ideas, literal and non-literal. And from the Quran, is not he who created the heavens and the earth. So there are 2 quotes useful for creation there. Okay, so the scientific explanations of the Big Bang theory, the idea that the universe began in a single point and exploded, and the universe is expanding, and we know it's expanding because when you look up through like telescopes at night, you can see the stars and planets moving away from us slowly, and we can detect this through the light, and it changes colour, and they call it redshift. So the light looks a little bit more red if it's moving away from us. It's the same thing as the Doppler effect in physics. So when a car or a train or something goes past and it makes a sound, it goes meow. I'll do that again for you because I know you're laughing. Meow. Alright. That basically means the sound waves are changing if they're coming towards you or moving away from you. And the same thing is happening with stars which are emitting light. And so you get this redshift thing. The famous scientists who came up with the Big Bang Theory are Stephen Hawking. So he described it first of all. And you also have the explanation for where life came from, which is the theory of evolution. So Charles Darwin was the first man to describe the theory of evolution in The Origin of Species. That animals change slowly according to natural selection to adapt to their environment, and therefore you don't need God to create animals. We're created, we're evolved like that. Richard Dawkins is a modern scientist. I met him once. Nice chap. That he describes evolution as well in his books. For example, The Blind Watchmaker and The Selfish Gene. I've also got the design argument, a picture of a watch, and William Paley written down there. A scientific explanation for where the world came from is something called the design argument. And so you look at the world and you can draw a comparison. So you might look at the human eye or a flower or a plant or something like that, and you can see elements of design. So if you look at an eye, it has a lens, it has a cornea, it has muscles, in the same way that a telescope might have kind of a lens and focus for light and so on. And so if a telescope or a man-made object is designed by a human, it has a designer, Therefore, we can also look at natural objects like the human body or an eye or the universe itself, and you can say that must also have a designer by default, and that designer would be God. So you can look at the world and see its design. It's all about creation. You've got the Bible's explanation, you've got the Big Bang, you've got evolution, and the design argument as well. So these need to be explained. The next idea they put in this part of a course, I'm not sure why they do it here, but they talk about stewardship. This is about creation and protecting the environment. And so the first idea is dominion, which is the idea that we are created and we are the most important part of creation. And God told us we are the most important part of creation. We can rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air. Genesis 1:28. So we're told we're the pinnacle of creation. We can do what we want with creation, basically. Stewardship is the idea that we should care for and look after the environment. And so if there's a question on how should we treat the environment in any form, you can talk about recycling and sustainable living, and so on. But because Adam and Eve were created and told to cultivate and guard the Garden of Eden, we're told we should look after creation. Also because we need to look after God's kind of creation. And so you can talk about global citizens, so we're citizens of the world, and you can also use the quote, love your neighbour of the future. And so if we damage the world now, future generations will suffer. The Islamic view is also quite interesting. You can use the term Khalifa. So humans are God's representatives on earth, and so we have a duty to kind of respect him and show, what's the word I'm looking for? But we can show that respect for God by respecting his creation. This idea of fitra, so there's a natural balance in nature, and if we damage the environment, we will create an imbalance, and we've seen that by destroying the natural world. People in China treating the natural world not very well and locking animals up in small cages and eating all sorts of strange things. That's unleashed the coronavirus upon us. So we've seen an example of that recently. The earth is green and beautiful. God has appointed you his stewards. It's a good quote to grab, so pause this slide and then write that one down as well to back that up for the Islamic perspective. Right, now we get on to the questions of abortion, and euthanasia kind of comes afterwards. So the abortion question, I'm going to give you some little quotes for it. So, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. This tells us in the Bible, in the Old Testament, that God knows everything and God has a plan for you. If you take away life or you abort a child before it's born, you're going against God's plan. And so the Catholic view is against this. They don't think abortion is acceptable. Only God can take life. It goes against the sanctity of life principle, and he's the only one who has the ability to take life or should take life. But the Anglicans think, sorry, I'm just yawning. The Anglicans think it's acceptable in certain situations. So, for example, in the case of rape, or it's going to harm the mother, or something like that. If you are completely against abortion, you're what we call pro-life. If you think it's okay in certain situations and you think it's the woman's right to choose, you can call it pro-choice. They're good phrases to use in religious studies GCSE. Right, we've also got the example down the bottom. This was quite a recent case. Savita Halapanvar, she was in Ireland and she requested an abortion because there was a problem with her pregnancy. She was refused an abortion, and then she died after an infection and complications. And so she died after being refused to have an abortion. She's a good example for a pro-choice kind of campaign. So you should allow it because you end up with people and mothers dying unnecessarily. So you've got sanctity of life, and the moment of conception is the moment when the sperm and the egg kind of comes together, and then that's the moment when Catholics believe life begins. On the Islamic side, there's a useful quote: "Do not kill a soul which God has forbidden to be killed, and God has a plan for all people." Okay, so pause the video for a moment and make sure you've got those notes there. The other example, the lady down here, she was a survivor of an attempted abortion. So her mum was young, I think she had sort of lots of problems at home, alcohol and drugs and so on, got pregnant, tried to abort the child. She survived, and then she has a mild disability of cerebral palsy, I believe, but she survived. Now she campaigns for a pro-life and so argues that her life is worth living. Okay, so for euthanasia, this man here is a guy called Tony Nicklinson, and he had a very recent case. Was it 2016? 2016 was he was in the news and he was on there, and so he was campaigning, tweeting, sending messages out, and so on about kind of his condition. He had locked-in syndrome, whereby he couldn't communicate and he was losing control of his muscles and his ability to communicate, and so he's basically trapped inside his body, and he communicated through a computer screen. The different versions of euthanasia, or different types you need to know about, are voluntary. If a person chooses, expresses they want to have it. Tony Nicklinson is an example. And a passive euthanasia is when somebody's unable to communicate that, so if they're in a coma. So the example to use is Tony Nicklinson. He had motor neuron disease, so he had a poor quality of life. If you had a very severe form of cancer or a terminal illness, you may choose to end your life prematurely. The arguments against euthanasia, basically all the churches are against it, Catholic and Anglican. The sanctity of life principle, basically God can take life, and there could be pressure on elderly people or vulnerable people who think their lives are not worth living. You've also got the hospices as an alternative, and so you do have hospices around the UK which specialise in end-of-life care, making people comfortable and can make lives worth living in a sort of positive way. Okay, maybe pause that and just make notes of that if you can. And there's other general arguments you can make about people could be pressurised into having euthanasia. If you allow euthanasia to happen, could it result in what's called a slippery slope, which would mean if you allow euthanasia in certain cases, it might become more and more common. If you had older people getting it, it might have younger people, you might have children having euthanasia, and so if you allow it in one case, you might end up with more and more people having euthanasia over time. Okay. You also need to know about the humanist perspective. And so a very famous humanist is a guy called Peter Singer, and he campaigns for euthanasia because he says it's acceptable if you can legislate for it, if you can make sure doctors accept it, you get permission from the person who's having euthanasia, and he argues from a position which is called utilitarianism. And so if you're going for the 8s and 9s in our possible mock exams that may be coming our way, who knows, utilitarianism is the greatest good for the greatest number, so you should do what benefits most people. And if you legalise euthanasia in a country, lots of people who are scared of what's going to happen to them when they get old and infirm may feel happier knowing that they can choose the moment of their death, maybe, or people might be frightened that they might think their doctor is able to take their life. They might be frightened of medical care if that's the case. Although I will say this hasn't happened in Switzerland or the Netherlands, where it is legal at the moment. And so if you're in something like a persistent vegetative state where you basically can't move or communicate, maybe euthanasia is acceptable in that case. So, belief about the soul and afterlife. Belief about the soul and the afterlife. This is the next key idea. So, in this section, some of the key language to use. So, do you have a soul? Do you believe there's life after death? Those are interesting questions. Some philosophers believe in something called dualism. So, the body and the soul are two separate things. Your body is material, your soul is non-physical. Materialism is the idea that we are just stuff, you're just matter. Your brain is just stuff, in the same way as your fingernails are just stuff, and when you die it will just rot away and your personality and who you are just vanishes into nothing. If you believe in an afterlife and a soul, you believe your spirit can go on and live on somewhere else in heaven or the afterlife and so on. So if you're St. Thomas Aquinas, you believe the soul continues, the soul is implanted at the moment of conception when the sperm and the egg kind of comes together. Look at this amazing image here. This is the soul, this is the baby arriving in the mother. Look at that terrifying image. That's amazing. Right. And in Islam, so a belief in fitra, you have this natural belief in God when you're born. you believe in the soul still, but they believe the soul comes in at a moment of quickening when the mum first detects the movement of the baby inside the womb. Adam was made from clay, was created by God, and every child is born in a state of fitra. So life is sacred, life is important. We have this soul, we have this innate ability, and it all comes from Allah. So basically write down all those words on the screen. Okay. Now, that is an amazing image. Look at that. Look at that little baby flying in. Amazing. Okay. Right. Oh yeah. The soul arrives at 120 days in Islam. The soul arrives at 120 days in Islam. Okay. Don't know how they can be so precise, but there we go. Right. Heaven and hell. New branch in your notes. So, the Christians. The Christians believe in resurrection. This is shown through Jesus, who was resurrected after he was crucified on the cross. They believe there is eternal life, which can be accessed through belief in God and in hell, in heaven or hell and purgatory. Heaven is a place of union with God. Hell is a place of separation, a place of loneliness. Some people believe it's a physical place of torture and torment. And you also have this place of purgatory, which is this middle ground, this somewhere in the middle where you're waiting to be purified in order to get into heaven. In order to describe that and how you get into heaven, Jesus told us a parable, the parable of the sheep and the goats, where if you're good, when I was hungry you fed me, when I was thirsty you gave me a drink, when I was hungry you didn't feed me, when I was thirsty you didn't give me a drink. And that is the story that Jesus told to show how people be separated like a shepherd separates his sheep and his goats. As a parable that's really useful for lots of questions. They might ask questions about heaven and hell. Are they real? Are they symbolic? Some Christians believe it's a real place. Some people think it's a non-literal way of describing it, a way of sort of punishment. And you can think of it as like if you're an alcoholic, for example, and you drink lots of alcohol, and then 10 years later you have liver damage, you've lost your job, you're in a very bad situation, you've chosen bad choices which end up with you in a very poor state of health and state of mind. So maybe hell is like that, where if you do bad things during your life, you end up in a bad situation, maybe. If you're a horrible person, you lose all your friends, you're lonely. So maybe that's kind of a possibility. Islam has quite an advanced understanding of what the afterlife is like, and so they believe that the earthly life is preparation for the life to come, and that's called akira. They believe in Azrael is the angel which comes to collect you at the moment of death, and they do believe in judgment. And so Israfil is going to blow his trumpet, as well as the earthquakes, as well as the nakedness, drunkenness. The coming of the Mahdi will signal the end times, and then you will be divided up and judged and sent to heaven or hell, Jannah or Jahannam, depending on if you've been good or bad. So just think about that a moment in year 11. Are you going to Jannah or Jahannam? Have you done your homework? Let's just think about that for a moment. That will determine whether you go to heaven or hell. Okay. If you're a humanist, they don't believe in an afterlife. They're materialists. They think the mind, the human being is just a physical thing. When you die, you rot. That's kind of the end of you. There is some nice ideas from Richard Dawkins where he talks about you live on through your intellectual power. So if you've written a book, or you've affected society, or you've made an impact through your works, that will kind of carry on after you. But apart from that, you're dead. You're gone. See you later. Okay. But pause that if you need to make a few more notes on that section. Right, let's talk about funerals. Again, I'm not sure why I put funerals in this bit. That's what it's all about. Where does life come from? Can we take life? What happens when you die? Let's talk about funerals then. So, the Christian view on funerals is you have a service to mark the end of your life. They carry out a last rites in Catholicism, and they have a last Holy Communion service. They take a confession. And they will say certain things at the funeral service. They will have, the family will gather, there'll be certain rituals that take place. We'll say certain prayers, for example, from the Gospel of John, where it says, I am the resurrection, I am the life. This is Jesus talking about this, and it's a comforting prayer which is said to the congregation, so the person who's died is still with them in some form. They'll use candles, which are symbolic for Jesus being the light of the world, and they might sing a prayer, one of the songs like "The Lord is my shepherd," and that's meant to be a comforting one, to show God is with the human, with the person who has kind of passed away. They will also say things like ashes to ashes, dust to dust, which links to the Genesis story, because God created us from clay in the Islamic story, or dust in the Christian story, and so you've come from dust, you return to dust, and so it's kind of the sort of closing the circle, if you like. It's meant to be sort of comforting as well. For the Muslim perspective, when you're about to die, they whisper the Shahada, the declaration of faith, into your ear. Obviously, get hit by a bus, it's very difficult to do that, but if people are like slowly passing away in a hospital or something, that's easier to do. And you get 24 hours before you've got to be buried, and this comes from where Islam originated, so it was a good idea to bury bodies quickly in a hot part of the world. It's less of an issue around here, but they still do burials in 24 hours. They wrap the body in a shroud, usually the cloth they've done the Hajj in. They wash the body symbolically by a member of the same sex, and they bury the body facing Mecca. Okay. So let's look at some key quotations, which are kind of the key ones I think are quite important for this section. So add these to your little mind map there. So for Christianity, there's quite a long one here, but it says, "Have many children so that your descendants will live all over earth and bring it under their control. I'm putting you in charge of the fish, the birds and the animals." That's about creation. That's about people having dominion over creation. God looked at everything he had made and he was pleased. So if you take away life or damage the environment in any way, that's seen as a very bad thing. And I choose you before you were born. Very useful for the euthanasia and abortion questions. So for Islam, a good creation quote is this one, and it is, "He who created the heavens and the earth in 6 days. The earth is green and beautiful, and Allah has appointed you his stewards over it." Again, a nice quotation to support the idea of protecting Allah's creation. And also, "Take not life which Allah has made sacred." So don't take life, don't destroy life, it's down to God. Okay. What is meant by sanctity of life? These are some example questions. I'm going to talk you through a few model answers to these. Sanctity of life is quite easy, but you need to say at least 2 sentences to get your 2 marks. So if there's a question on sanctity of life, you could say principles or standards determining which actions are right and wrong. For example, a Christian might follow the teachings of Jesus or the 10 Commandments. Just realise that's completely